Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff, and we're very glad to welcome back onto the program Matthew Hoh, who's the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network and an Emeritus Senior Fellow with the Center for International Policy. He is a disabled Marine Corps combat veteran, and in 2009, Matt resigned his post with the State Department in Afghanistan in protest over the escalation of that war. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Eleanor. It's good to see you and be here with you.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. And I wanted to start off here, Matt, with a line that I found at a post over at usconstitution.net, and it's run by constitutional analysts. Quote, every American military officer swears an oath that begins with 10 critical words. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Not the president, not the party in power, not the Secretary of Defense, the Constitution. And in that piece, they go on to outline why this distinction is an important one, not least of all, thanks to current head of the War Department, Pete Hegseth's recent theatrics. But I also know from experience in our lovely land of the free that what's in writing or in speeches often chafes with the lived realities and indeed expectations of those in power. So Matt, I was wondering if you could start off by describing from your experience and expertise, is the military oath in practice as pure as perhaps the authors suggest that it's meant to be?
I don't think it is, just because I think for the vast majority of the millions upon millions of men and women who've been in the military, that oath never really becomes a real thing, right? They're never really tested by some crucible or some challenge or some confrontation that requires them to examine who their obedience is towards, where their allegiance lies. They don't have to pull out, go on the web and Google, what did I say 2 years ago when I reenlisted? So I think for most people, it's an academic or maybe it's intellectual. Certainly, I think there are times that men and women in the military will have discussions with peers, and they will get into that type of more, again, abstract, philosophical aspects of their service. But for most men and women in the U.S. military, it's no different than men and women working anywhere. You're there doing a job. You got your day to day. You're just trying to get through the day without something burning down. You just realize that how are you going to get and pick up the dog from the groomers at the same time as getting your kids from soccer practice or whatever, right? So for most people, but there are for some, and particularly you get to the higher ranks, this type of concept of not just where their obedience and allegiance lay in terms of not to a person or to an institution. Your obedience is not to the Marine Corps or the Army or the Navy or the Air Force or the Space Force or the Coast Guard or what have you. And I should say this is the same oath that all members of the U.S. government take. So if you're a judge or a lawyer being sworn in, if you're, any role. When I joined the State Department, this was the oath I took. Park rangers take this oath, so on and so forth, The aspects of it, though, again, going past this idea of where's your allegiance? Is it to a person, an institution? No, it's to this document, to the Constitution. And that, of course, then is very abstract, right? That is very much, okay, it's to a piece of paper that exists in the archives, right? But the meaning of that then is that, no, it's just not just to the Constitution as drafted by Jimmy Madison, 250 years ago or whatever, where we're at with that. It's to the entire body of law. It's to a republic based upon the rule of law, and that you must follow all the legal aspects of the institutions to which you belong to, whether institution is small or large, it all falls under that framework. So I think, having that understanding of where their obedience and allegiance needs to be, again, certainly not to a man, not to an institution, and not to some document, the piece of paper sitting in the archives, but to the actual body of law that governs their institutions and their conduct. And I think this is why so many people are upset at the military in terms of their relationship with Donald Trump, where they are not acting in obedience or allegiance to the Constitution, and they're certainly not acting in obedience or allegiance to the precedent set by things such as the Nuremberg trials, right? That established a clear, international body of law that we are bound to through our Constitution, right? We are bound to international law, to any treaties that we sign or become a part of. But then the other aspect too is the ethos of it, right? I mean, so there's a whole other aspect of this aside from the semantic legal aspect, but rather an ethos and a morality, professionalism that's required to be followed as well.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that a little bit because this international law and such because getting a little bit more into the Hegseth theatrics, he brought up the quote unquote warrior ethos, which again, there's a whole conversation about the toxicity of warrior ethos as the world's largest empire, but on its face here, Hegseth was suggesting that officers should avoid politics that oppose Trump administration priorities while enthusiastically implementing politics that support them. Now, the counter argument to that, of course, is that the warrior ethos, quote unquote, is about commitment to a mission, resilience under adversity, and loyalty to fellow soldiers. It's not about unquestioning obedience to political leaders or abandoning constitutional principles in favor of ideological purity, quote unquote. But I have a few questions about that. First of all, isn't the president the commander in chief of the armed forces? So isn't it kind of your job to do what he says? And as someone who has been in war zones where clearly the goal was not to uphold international law, was not to uphold the Constitution, but rather bolster U.S. hegemony and indeed ideological purity of U.S. exceptionalism, what's your read on what Hegseth is demanding? I mean, is it just a case of saying the quiet part loud? Is that why it's problematic, or is there something beyond that?
Well, I think that aspect of Hegseth first. These are men and women in power now who see themselves as revolutionaries. These are men and women who see themselves in power as being brought here. Some of them believe they're on a divine mission, and they sincerely believe that. That they are at a crucial intersection of history, whether it's become America has lost its way or because God, wants them to be in this spot right now. They believe their role is not simply historic, but revolutionary. I think we would say they're not revolutionaries, they're reactionaries, but they view themselves as a revolutionary. And that's what's so important, right? Because what we think matters, but it really matters what they think, how they, right? I mean, so, he sees himself as Hegseth sees himself as necessarily rebuilding, fixing, purifying the American military into the force of arms that America, he may believe once had, but he believes also as well that it needs for the current and coming challenges. So I think that's, you look at his speech to the generals as well as, the multitude of other statements he's made, the idea of going towards a white Christian patriarchal military is what they want. I mean, certainly he's a macho guy. He's a tough guy. He's he's genuinely invested in this idea of the warrior ethos, as you were speaking of, and that's a very mythological, fictionalized type of thing. And that warrior ethos, the way Hegseth and those like him believe it to be, is opposed by a professional ethos. So the warrior ethos, as Hegseth describes, when it comes into being, when it's actually enacted, it results in war crimes. It results in atrocities. It results in kill anything that move policies. The Israeli army in Gaza has a warrior ethos in the manner in which Pete Hegseth believes in. And that is in contradiction to the professional ethos. So you have maybe a barbaric or a mythological or a wannabe warrior ethos that you can juxtapose against the professional military ethos, which is one of a professional warrior that the American military, and I know this is going to sound ridiculous based upon the evidence and history of the American military, but at least what it's taught in the schools, and this is a whole other thing we can get into them, right? About the whole folly of warfare, the whole ridiculousness of believing that you can have this professionalism in something that's one superhuman like war, where war, no matter how moral and ethical and guided by professionalism you think you are, that you're going to be your own agent, and war is going to make you an agent of its purposes, right? So, this Hegseth belief in this war ethos, when it comes out, what does it look like? It looks like melee, right? I mean, it looks like massacre. It looks like atrocity. It looks like Gaza. And that doesn't coexist with the ethos that the United States military has had, particularly since the end of the World War II. Again, so encapsulated by, for example, the Nuremberg trials, right? And that establishing a duty to order, a duty to law, right? I mean, so all that, that gets in the way of what Hegseth wants. And so getting back to this idea of him wanting to cull the military, he wants to chase people out. He wants women to leave. He wants minorities to leave. And they don't care that women and minorities make up half of the U.S. military. If you were to say to them, what are you going to do? Well, we'll just bring in more people. We'll recruit more soldiers. We'll have technology. We'll use mercenaries. They have ways in their minds for how they could have a military of less than 1 million that to them would be more effective, that to them would be more lethal, that to them would be more efficient, and certainly it would also be, in some of their greater desires, more pure, right? So when you see Hegseth up there speaking about these types of things, he's not saying things where he doesn't know what the consequences are. They do know what the consequences are. And the point about the generals sitting there quietly, they are okay with this. Many of them are men and women who are close to retirement anyway. At that speech in Quantico, many of them, understand I've only got a year or 2 or 3 before I retire anyhow, so I can get through this. That's just if they even care. Many of them don't care. Many of them think that many of them are in line with what Hegseth is thinking. The American generalships, the flag officers, it's always been politicized. It always has been. So it's men and women who've known how to climb the career ladder. And then once you get past a certain spot, once you get to be a colonel or a captain in the Navy, it's very much all political. And, so, that type of intra-institution knife fighting to get to those few type spots, well, these are the men and women who made it through that. These are the men and women who won. And so their instincts, as well as their experiences and their skills to do such things, if they say they just have to salute and follow Hegseth, then so be it to get to the next level. So you have, but then the other thing too is that with that, you have men and women who, these are not men and women who are going to act out of any sense of morality. These are men and women who are not going to act out of any sense of professional ethos or any type of adherence to the rule of law. If they were, they would have spoken out about Trump and Hegseth firing many of their peers for reasons of race, sex, and politics. They would have spoken out when the Judicial Advocacy General Corps lost its entire leadership. So the lawyers for the Pentagon were fired very quickly by Hegseth. They would have spoken out when General C.Q. Brown was fired as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for no reason given. You could have given a reason. You could have said, "Look, United States, we lost this battle in the Red Sea to the Yemenis. We've got to fire somebody for that." I think a lot of people would actually kind of be relieved by that. Wow, there's some accountability going on here. But no. There was no reason given. So CQ Brown being fired. And, the only thing you can look, when you look back at what have these people said before, well, you see Hegseth saying things like CQ Brown is a diversity hire. So was CQ Brown fired as the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff strictly because he was black? I believe so. And all the evidence points to that. And not one general admiral said, this is wrong. If Brown's out, I'm out too. You had other, you've had other things as well. You've had the extrajudicial killing of civilians in boats in the Caribbean. We could find all other kinds of ways the U.S. is breaking its own laws as well as international laws with its military. But just for example, these spectacular murders of people. And maybe they are carrying drugs. Who knows? I don't know. But we don't know. We don't have any evidence. Let alone the fact that for transporting drugs, it's not the penalty is not the death penalty anyway. But you have these extrajudicial killings, these murders carried out by the U.S. military. No generals or admirals have said, this is wrong, I'm not going along with it. And then, of course, we've had American soldiers, whether it's Federalized National Guard or active duty Marines, being placed into American cities where they are supporting the detention, the brutalization, the humiliation of American citizens, of legal residents, and immigrants. And again, no American general admiral has said anything. No American general admiral is saying anything about troops going to Chicago right now, right? And what that's fraught with. One, just the constitutional legal aspects. Does the president have the power to do this, to mobilize something like this? But also, too, the danger of it. You're bringing troops from another area, from another state, to police another part of the country. That sounds like a recipe for civil war, doesn't it? Shouldn't these men and women who are in uniform be saying, look, I've read a lot of history and I know how this type of thing can go. No, they're not. They're all going along with it. So you had, particularly last week after Hegseth's speech, where the general sat there impassively and didn't show emotion. That's more or less what they're supposed to do. If people ever watch the State of the Union address, the Joint Chiefs will sit there emotionless, just as the Supreme Court justices do. This is what they're supposed to do. And people reading into it is as some form of defiance. Oh, well, great. If that's it, if that was the defiance, their theatrics there, then we are cooked. We will know where the American military lies, because their silence was obedience. Their silence was complicity. Trump even gave them an out. Trump said, if you don't agree with me, get up and walk out. And those are men and women, every one of them. If you're a general, you're retiring with about at least $150,000 a year retirement pay. It's about that probably for them, averaging it out, plus all other kinds of opportunities. So, yeah,
yeah, and I want to get to the National Guard in a second, but it seems to me that then the culture is one of this blind obedience, this kind of individualistic, well, I fought my way to get to this high appointed space. I'm gonna stay here, and it's not that big of a deal. I'll leave soon. And also that this ask or this demand, this overt demand to commit war crimes, is it kind of one of those things where it's the military's well, we were kind of doing that thing anyway, so I guess we'll just keep on doing what we've been doing.
Right. You had, again, and these are men and women then who were in Quantico, who have all been in, maybe the most junior one in there, say a one-star general, maybe has only 22 years in the military, maybe that, and that would be extreme. Usually they have at least 25 years or more. And then when you're talking about the 3- and 4-star general, these are all men and women who have been in for over 30 years. And the same thing too with the senior enlisted advisors that were there, the command sergeant majors, the sergeant majors from the Marine Corps, the master chiefs, the command master chiefs from the Navy, et cetera. I forget what the Air Force calls their people. But these are all men and women who have been in the service for, at that point, over 30 years, right? So the point about that is that these are all soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines that went through the Iraq and Afghan wars and stayed in. They stayed silent. And any supposed lessons they learned, or, that maybe they were junior officers or junior troops at the time, at the height of the Iraq war, and they said, when they were majors or when they were, gunnery sergeants or whatnot, I'm not going to do this when I'm, if I'm still in, I'm not going to go along with this. I mean, I had that happen when I was in the Marines, like when I was an officer in the late 90s, particularly say in 1998 when I was a second lieutenant going through my officer training in Quantico. And I mean, the number of colonels and because, you had plenty of Marines who were still senior officers and enlisted who had been in Vietnam, and so you had, one after another, they'd say things like, again, this is 1998, you'd have colonels and generals and sergeant major say, we're never going to fight a war like that again. We're never going to fight a landlocked war. We're never going to have another Vietnam. And then, a few years later, we had two, I mean, so when it comes down to it, again, you could see not just by the silent obedience that we saw on display in Quantico, but also as well their lack of action in these last 10 months. Why should we believe they're going to do anything differently?
Yeah, so much for that mythological war ethos. And I
Yeah,
wanted
yeah,
to,
and it's disturbing because I feel like that, particularly on liberal blogs and liberal podcasts and TV shows, there's this assumption that the generals are going to save us, right? I'm sure if we went and pulled open a copy of the Atlantic or something like that, there's at least one article how the generals are going to save us because they didn't clap during Hegseth's speech last week. I mean, like, so, yeah. I mean, the delusion of the liberal class in this country. Yeah,
it's pretty I mean, it's the
yeah.
same way that, we're saved because the Democratic members of Congress wore pink to Trump's first State of the Union address.
Right. That did it.
So
That
everyone,
really
we just
showed
need
them.
to wear more pink.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I want to,
I just didn't have to go on a tangent, but I just had a friend of mine from overseas say, so if all these people in the U.S. and Democratic Party who are now saying that I told you so, I knew how bad Trump was, how come they're not prepared to do anything about it? Right? So if you honestly knew 2 years ago how bad Trump was going to be and you're in the Democratic Party in some form of leadership capacity, how come you didn't do anything about it? How come you didn't prepare better? How come you didn't come up with a plan, except
yeah,
for we're going to wear pink, or yeah.
or that Kamala Harris was your choice.
Well, that's a whole other thing.
Uh, and I want to shift to talk a little bit about, because you mentioned the National Guard, and of course, as listeners might be aware, I mean, we're recording this on Wednesday, October 8th, so some things might happen between now and this coming Monday in Chicago and indeed elsewhere. But I want to talk about the kind of context here, and the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, and here at Project Censored, we're very aware of the importance of history and contextualizing our present and influencing our future. So the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 restricts using federal military forces for domestic law enforcement. The law emerged from Reconstruction era concerns about military occupation of southern states and federal troops enforcing civil authority. And it establishes that military forces exist to defend against foreign threats, not to police American citizens, except, because there's always that except, in extraordinary circumstances where the Insurrection Act allows the president to deploy troops to suppress rebellion or enforce federal authority when states cannot. Now, of course, there's a lot of gray and vague area here. And the president just seems to be at leisure to decide when those extraordinary circumstances are. And here's the thing. Some of us might agree with prior use, i.e. Eisenhower used it in 1957 to enforce school desegregation in Little Rock. The issue is still that there is but a paltry 1878 legislative line between the military pointing their guns out versus in. And so here again, Matt, I'd like to pick your brain on how this shows up on the inside. Is there an understanding of this line? Is it seen as a big deal to cross it, in your opinion?
Well, I think for most men and women in the military, it's something that would never have occurred to them. And certainly they're, facing outward. They're not facing inward. Many of them are stationed abroad. And certainly the work that they do is to support efforts abroad, wars, incursions, invasions, occupations, right? I mean, there's so little introspection about that, let alone, right, this idea that maybe possibly we would be told to, but the history of it is so scant, right, to be fair. The role of, like, say, the active duty military, but then, of course, incorporate the federalized National Guard in roles like this, it's scant. I think I should be careful how I say this. It's scant for those who haven't studied the history as deeply as yourself or I would assume probably most of the listeners of this program. So the idea that guard, troops have been used to put down strikes, right? That they've been brought in to put down riots, things like that. Often in circumstances where a little bit of hindsight, you can say, my God, that was really oppressive. That was really disgusting. That was really un-American what was done there, utilized for crass political purposes to either strike down, to repress urban protest or workers protesting, right? I mean, so you have within the military, though, again, it's simply not something that will come up. But for the senior officers, this is something that they should be aware of and they should be contemplative of, whether it's as I said before, whether it's like the strictly legal aspect of this. Look, the U.S. military is not supposed to be a police force. There needs to be an insurrection or some extraordinary circumstance. In say, the case in 1957 with Eisenhower, the extraordinary circumstance was you had a state that was refusing the orders of the Supreme Court. And that you also had, Eisenhower originally intended to use the National Guard, and said he ended up having to send active duty soldiers there. But he did so because the Guard refused to accept mobilization from the federal government. So you had insubordination, you had mutiny, you had insurrection, which that's a war we fought already. I mean, we fought that in the 1860s, this concept of states' rights. And the result was it doesn't exist except as through a federalized system where there is a hierarchy. What you have here, I don't think anyone reasonable looks at this and says that there's extraordinary circumstances or that's insurrection. And certainly the statements that come out of this administration are, exaggerated, hyperbolic, ludicrous, insane. The statements from Trump say about Oregon, which is where this, where he also wants to send soldiers into Portland, wants to bring them up from California. And, that as we speak is quelled right now, or at least it's in limbo, I guess. But, his descriptions of Portland are, sounds like it's Stalingrad in 1943. Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. But also, too, I heard today, listening on Democracy Now, and a clip from the head of ICE in Chicago, where he talks about how militants are terrorizing the people of Chicago, and it sounds like a post-apocalyptic film. And that's something we could do a whole show on, the role of Hollywood in shaping, right, our culture, shaping our society to make it such that you need the American military to come in to save the day. I remember there was this terrible Matthew McConaughey movie from 25, 30, maybe 30 years ago, where he's fighting dragons. Like, dragons come and they destroy the world. And then, like, right, it's a terrible, terrible movie. But it's among other things, is I think it was called Reign of Fire, right? Reign, REIGN, right?
Duh.
Right, exactly. Everything about it was just stomach turning. And I watched it because I was like, okay, cool. It was Matthew McConaughey fighting dragons, and it was just so lame. And particularly at the end, because what saves at the end is a militarized force, right? We just need bigger guns. We need to put together in a more orderly fashion, put a guy in charge, and then we'll fight and beat these dragons. But for many Americans, though, this idea, that this thought, this narrative that what we need to have to restore order, to protect people, is what we need to have for some type of justice and peace, is some type of restorative violence, right? So both this myth of restorative violence and redemptive violence dominate American society. It dominates our storytelling. It dominates our myths. It dominates our narratives, right? It makes up so much of who we are. We're getting ready for the 250th anniversary of this country, right? And so hopefully there will be, well, it's not going to happen, but you would like to think there'd be some really great examinations of it, really pull apart what we understand about what was life, why, 250 years ago, less than a third of the people in the colonies support independence. Why was that? What was going on? And so all that, again, a whole other show. But yeah, I mean, the use of the military in this role as a police force, I think, is something that most would say is un-American. But we have, evidence that has been done in the past. It's not popular evidence or well known, as we discussed. And then as well, too, you have a leadership in the military that seems like it's going to be okay with it happening.
I feel like you and I need to have a solid other podcast examining films like Independence Day and.
Oh gosh, yeah. I remember going to see that in the theater. Yeah.
Oh, me too. Well, and I think I remember going, or at least I saw it once with a Swedish friend who was like, "This is dumb," and I was like, "This is awesome."
Yeah,
and I was like, and then I had some reflection, like, why do I think this is awesome?
Well, Independence Day is so amazing because it blends two things, right? And I'm talking about the one from 1995, not the more recent remake, which is another one we could.
Totally I didn't even know there was a remake.
There was a remake, and the U.S. military, the Department of Defense, now the Department of War, was heavily involved with that as a recruiting effort.
Nice.
And there was all vehicles and mechanisms in place with the film to push kids to the recruiting station.
Oh.
But with the 195, it is this blend of our own technology plus citizen soldiers save us from the aliens. And aliens can be interchangeable, whether they're from, Mars or that guy's got brown skin. And I think I heard him say, amigo, or something, right? I mean, like,
yep.
Like that kind of thing, like, right. I mean, so you have these understandings of who we are as a people, particularly on the right. And that's all that matters. What do they believe? What do they understand? How does everything that Trump, Kristi Noem, Stephen Miller, Pete Hegseth, these demagogues, how does that resonate with the people that they are talking to? Not to you and I, right? But to the people that they are talking to. How does it resonate? I mean, you see this recruitment effort for ICE, and I think the same thing will be done for the National Guard, where they will get the people that they want. They will get the brutes that exist among us who, for multiple reasons. Oh, I should have pulled it up, that had it ready. Fulfill that understanding by Fyodor Dostoevsky about how blood and power are intoxicating. How if you have ever humiliated someone, it becomes intoxicating. How tyranny is organic. And I'm not doing the quote justice. People please go and Google Dostoevsky, Blood and Power. It's from the House of the Dead. But you read that and you see certainly not just the senior leaderships, not just the Stephen Millers and the Pam Bondis, these cruel sadists that are in power now, but you see the people that will follow them, that will join them. And so this current ICE expansion, I have no doubt they're going to get the people that they need. National Guard as well. Maybe their numbers, it's supposedly National Guard recruitment's gone up, and maybe over time those numbers will decline as women and minorities say, this isn't for me. But certainly they will get plenty of white men and women who look at what happened in Chicago, look what happened in Portland, look what happened in Washington, D.C., and they say that's exactly what needs to be done. And I want to be a part of it.
Yeah, well, and I mean, there's so many different threads to go on here, like the gamification of this stuff and how, everyone gets to live their Hollywood ideal and how Hollywood is so complicit and how the Pentagon has bragged about how much influence they have in Hollywood. There's so many threads we could go on here. But alas, we are restricted by the clock. So, Matt, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and talk about this from the inside of the military, as you do so well and powerfully. Where's a good place for folks to check out the work that you do with the Eisenhower Media Center?
Mostly my Substack. That's probably the best place to go to. So just my name, Matthew Hoh, on Substack. Last name spelled Hoh. I'm on Twitter as well, Matthew P. Hoh, P as in Patrick, Hoh. And then, of course, you can go to the Eisenhower Media Network's webpage as well and find us there.